He was a literal musical genius. However, he was really crazy. He killed someone. Yep, he did. I've been wanting to do a story about Phil Spector for such a long time, and this took me a while to put this all together. Lots of research. I mean, he was a genius, a musical genius. So I decided to get out my old school spiral notebook, guys. This is what I do. I write. I literally put pen to paper, and I said, you know what? I'm going to get crack-a-lackin', and I'm going to give you guys the story of Phil Spector. I just wanted to find out why or how Phil Spector got to the point of really just losing it. I mean, I'm all about the music. I'm all about talking to musicians, hearing their story, but I'm also about finding out why and how a song got to be where it did, or how it was written and how it was put together. So Phil Spector is really just a great example of everything that he did, all of the amazing things that he did for the music industry, but in the back end, how crazy he really was. Now, before we get going and digging really deep into the story, by the way, it's going to be a long one, so if you need to get a drink or two, maybe a snack, it may be helpful, because this is going to take a little bit of time. And I didn't even include everything. I mean, the guy's life is so full of things. So if you say, well, you didn't talk about this, because there's a lot here, and I tried to pick out a lot of the main points in Phil Spector's life. This video is not sponsored by anyone or anything, and all of the research has been done by things I've looked up online. Google is my best friend. So I'm adding a disclaimer. This is just information I have looked up, and this is just for entertainment purposes only. I have my half-drunk iced coffee because it's really early, so I'm gonna... There we go. And I made that myself, by the way. So that's my own, and I reuse cups. I am very thrifty. I'm not that thrifty though. I'm not like that show on TLC, Extreme Cheapskates or Extreme Frugal, whatever the heck it's called. It's a brand new show. I love it. However, I am not reusing toilet paper. I'm just thrifty to the point of I save money where I can. Okay, let's get into this story, shall we? Harvey Philip Spector was born in the Bronx on December 26th of 1939. Not long after World War II started, and the most popular song that week was South of the Border by Shep Fields, but I don't know that song. Phil's parents were first-generation immigrants, and his father's last name was actually spelled with a K in the middle of Spector instead of a C. Phil's parents, Benjamin and Bertha, they were trying to make the best life that they could here in America for themselves and their children. Phil's dad, he was an iron worker who unfortunately and sadly committed suicide by piping carbon dioxide into his running car. Not a good way to kick off your life as a kid. Benjamin's son Henry, who we now know as Phil, he was only 9 years old when this happened. After Henry's dad committed suicide, Henry, his mom, and his sister Shirley, who in some places you actually see her name is Sharon. Not sure why, but just throwing it out there. So the family just picked up and they moved to LA. And Bertha picked up work as a seamstress to help support the family. This all happened in 1953, and Henry was now 14 years old. Phil's sister Shirley did pass away on April 23rd of 2004 at the age of 70. It is said that Phil liked to exaggerate. We're going to call him Phil now instead of Henry, because now we're getting to the point where things start to change. And it is said that Phil liked to make stories seem bigger than what they were. So he was kind of like a fibber, maybe we could call him that. He stretched the truth. Let's just say that. One of the stories that Phil liked to say later on in life is that he thought his mom and dad were actually first cousins. Phil liked to say this because Benjamin's father, now remember, he came over as an immigrant. His father's name was George, and Bertha, who also came over as an immigrant, her father's name was George. One man signed their immigration papers, so there was one witness, therefore leading Phil to believe that his parents were related. And we know that if that was true, inbreeding can lead to lots of things like mental disorders and genetic disorders. So we have to kind of keep that in the back of our wheelhouse as we move forward with the story. Phil was just not a good person. He wasn't. So I'm not saying this would be an excuse of him doing what he did throughout the years. He did a lot of bad things. And there is never an excuse to be a bad person. No one ever gets a pass for that. However, we can possibly and potentially understand maybe a little bit of why he turned into the person he did if this were to be true that his parents were first cousins. As we start to get into Phil's life in the music business, he put together his very first group called the Teddy Bears. And their very first hit, and it did become a hit, is called To Know Him Is to Love Him. And the name of that song, To Know Him Is to Love Him, came directly from the words written on Phil's father's headstone that his mother had put on there. And she said, to know him is to love him. Well, there's a hit song there somewhere. Guess what? There was! To Know Him Is to Love Him spent 3 weeks on the charts at #1. And at this point, Phil was only 19 years old. You're 19 years old and you have a #1 hit. So Phil was destined to push his way and be very successful in the music business, which he did do. Phil ended up putting a kibosh on the Teddy Bears group only a year after they were formed, and fun fact here, Annette Kleinbard, who was the Teddy Bears lead singer, co-wrote the theme for Rocky's film Gonna Fly Now. Like, who the heck knew that? And she co-wrote it alongside Ain Robbins and Bill Conti under the name of Carol Connors. And another fact about Annette/Carol, she testified against O.J. Simpson in 1995 because she had seen him the night before Nicole Brown Simpson was murdered at a charity event. Moving on, Phil had tremendous success with the Teddy Bears, but that was over, so now it's time to move on and create something new. So in come the Spectors 3, and that group came and originated during a time when Phil co-wrote a top 10 hit for Benny King called Spanish Harlem. We all know that one. You gotta know Spanish Harlem. And this song was written alongside Jerry Lieber, and this was a huge hit for Ben. You can clearly see that there is already a clear pattern of success forming for Phil. It was as if no matter what he worked on, it clicked, it made sense, and it made him money. In 1961, Phil and Lester Sill created Phillies Records, and pretty quickly they got the Crystals to be a part of their brand new record label. The Crystals released He's a Rebel, which was written by Gene Pitney, produced by Phil. Then Lester left the label, so Phil had this #1 hit all to himself. Phil had worked on new groups and created lots of new talent, which included the Ronettes, featuring Veronica Bennett, who later became known as Ronnie Spector. In August of 1963, the Ronettes released their huge hit Be My Baby, which Dick Clark penned as the song of the century. Oh my gosh, imagine having Dick Clark calling your song the song of the century. I can't even imagine what that must have felt like for the Ronettes and everybody around them who worked on that song. Moving forward just a little bit for just a second, in 1986, Ronnie gave part of that song to Eddie Money's song Take Me Home Tonight. And when I had the absolute honor to talk to Eddie Money, he said that Ronnie was just a sweetheart to work with. However, Phil did not treat Ronnie in the way that she should have been treated, but we'll talk about that in just a bit. Now, during this time of the Ronettes, this is when Phil Spector created what he's very well known for, and that is called the Wall of Sound. Phil's idea behind the Wall of Sound was to have a large orchestra behind the singer or singers, and his thought process was even if a song really sucked, it would sound really good because of the large sound it had behind it. Spector worked with a large group of session musicians. They were known as the Wrecking Crew, and they all played different instruments, lots and lots of instruments, guitars, drum kits. There were multiples of all of them within the Wall of Sound, and played by the Wrecking Crew. Then Phil would go in and layer all of these sounds, and you can really hear it in the Beach Boys hit, Wouldn't It Be Nice? Wouldn't It Be Nice has a full, crisp, encompassing sound. Now, I am not a musical critiqueal genius here, no. However, you can hear how the wall of sound worked in the song. And really, just to go ahead and turn on and listen to a Beach Boys song, it's the right thing to do. Danny once said that Phil actually created the second record company because Danny didn't have a chance or an opportunity to be a part of Philly's Records, very successful Philly's Records. And Danny was definitely an asset to Phil because Danny was awarded Promotional Man of the Year 2 years in a row in 1964 and 1965. So he had a lot of credit in the industry. And I also have to mention that when Phil Spector was only 21 years old, at that point he was already a millionaire and he was already considered a media mogul at 21 years old. He was huge and just getting bigger and bigger as the years went by. So getting back to Danny ended up working at Casablanca Records, and he was partially responsible for the success of Donna Summer. Oh my gosh, love that woman, and Kiss. So Phil definitely had the golden touch, not only of making great records, but also to be able to pick the right people to be part of his team. You know when someone has the knack to just get everything right? Yeah, those type of people. Phil was one of those people. Another group to become a part of this new record label that Phil created were the Righteous Brothers. And you know the hits that they had, Unchained Melody and You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin'. Good pick. The last hurrah for this newly created label by Phil Spector was the signing of Ike and Tina Turner. Tina Turner, we all know, is the queen. Ike, I don't know how these things happened. When Phil Spector inducted Ike and Tina Turner into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1991, he called Tina he had some really great words for her. He called her an American treasure and the closest thing to a diamond he had ever seen. And so true. However, when Ike Turner passed away on December 12th of 2007, Phil said that Ike was responsible for making Tina the jewel that she was. And the 1993 movie starring Angela Bassett, who played Tina Turner in What's Love Got to Do with It? If you haven't seen that movie, go ahead and watch it. It's sad and amazing at the same time. Angela did such an amazing job playing Tina Turner. Well, Phil Spector said that that film was a piece of trash and that none of that happened. Then you go and watch Tina's most recent documentary about her life. You can just take it from there. So at this point, it's now 1969. Phil's record company had been dissolved because he just wasn't seeing the success he had seen in the previous years. And this is also the time that he married Ronnie Spector of the Ronettes. Now Phil has a defunct record company. He married Ronnie, and their marriage was bad. It was so bad. I'll back up just for a second here. Phil and Ronnie adopted 3 children. So adopting children, I mean, that's a lot of work. I'm actually adopted. You know, you can feel kind of crappy about yourself if you allow it. You get adopted, you're like, oh, nobody wanted me. But I am very fortunate to have been adopted by the parents that I was. So, you know, it was a happy time for Ronnie and Phil. I would imagine they adopted these beautiful children. However, in 1972, Ronnie has been very open about the fact that she ran away from the mansion barefoot because the marriage between the two of them was so bad. And Phil was just bad. He was bad to her. Not a good person. Ronnie has a memoir, and in that memoir, she said that a lot of times I'm shaking my head throughout this video, but it's just insane to me. And again, we're just touching upon some things here, but Ronnie said that Phil kept a coffin in the basement of their mansion just in case she ever decided to leave him. He would kill her and put her in that coffin. Who does that? Well, Phil Spector did it. And Ronnie has said that Phil was just not able to function in real life. He was all about living his life inside of the recording studio. It's just sad. Sad and crazy. It is now where we start to begin to see where all of the cracks are just getting bigger and bigger in Phil's life. And just a hunch that these cracks were probably there for years and years and years, but we all, as, onlookers, didn't start to see all of this until later on. Until after after everything happened and when people were able to speak out about these things. We now go into the year of 1970, and this is the year that Phil got connected with the Beatles. It's a big deal. Phil ended up producing John Lennon and the Yoko Ono Plastic Band single Instant Karma, and here's another example where you can hear the wall of sound in full effect. It is said that it only took 10 days to produce, record, and even write Instant Karma. So that song is in the history books of being one of the fastest released songs in history, and Phil Spector has his name on that. Alan Klein, the Beatles manager at that time, along with Paul McCartney and George Harrison, brought Phil to England. That trip ended up being much bigger for Phil than it was originally intended. Phil was hired to actually put a spin on, re-record, and finish up the Beatles' final album, Let It Be. In that album, in various places, you can hear the Beatles chitter-chattering in the studio, and that was Phil's idea to include all of that in the album. However, Paul McCartney was just not a fan of that. I personally loved it. I loved hearing how they just kind of talked and it was off the cuff. I thought that was really cool. Paul McCartney was such not a huge fan of what Phil Spector added to the Let It Be album that Paul released his own version in 2003 called Let It Be Naked, and he removed anything and everything that Phil Spector did on their original release. In that same year, Phil produced George Harrison's triple album, All Things Must Pass, the gem of an album that includes two magnanimous hits from Mr. Harrison, What Is Life and My Sweet Lord. There is a song on that album called Wah Wah. George said he hated it. He did not like how Phil produced it, but it stayed, and it stayed the way Phil did it. Eric Clapton, who played guitar on this very famous album of George Harrison, said that he liked the way Phil did Wah Wah. So obviously George did not win that creative battle. There is a letter that I found online. It is kind of incredible. It has all notes from Phil Spector to George Harrison. It has every single song on the All Things Must Pass album with all kinds of notes for each song, what needs to be changed and updated. And it's just pretty meticulously written by Phil. And if I can, I will try to link that letter down below in the description box because it definitely is something just to take a quick read. And from this letter, you can definitely tell that Phil Spector was a perfectionist. Phil's Beatles connection ended up being really, really good for him because Phil ended up becoming the head A&R guy for Apple Records and also produced several songs for John and Paul, including the multi-generational hit Happy Christmas, The War Is Over. Big events and big things were happening for Phil and his career, but the bigger the things got, the more withdrawn Phil Spector became. It is said that because of the very bad car accident Phil was in 1974, he was almost declared dead, but a police officer at the scene felt a very faint pulse from Phil, therefore rushing him to the hospital and pretty much saving his life. But during this accident, Phil went through his car's windshield and he had several lacerations on his head and he got almost 700, maybe even more than 700 stitches between his face and his head. So he was pretty much messed up from that accident and he ended up being a lucky guy, or was he? Lucky. I mean, you gotta face it, Phil was messed up before the accident even happened. Remember, his wife Ronnie ran away from the mansion in 1972. We're now in 1974. And John Lennon's mistress, May Pang, at one point talked about how when they were all recording rock and roll, Phil fired his gun in front of everybody because he wasn't happy with how the record was progressing. And I'm totally surprised that John Lennon finished the record with him after all of that. And I guess there were a lot of other crazy things that happened too, but John obviously finished the record with Phil. In 1975, Phil created yet another record label called Warner Spector with, you guessed it, a collaboration with Warner Records. Cher and Darlene Love were part of the label's lineup. Then in 79, he produced the Ramones record, End of the Century. It's now 1979, and Phil produced the guys' fifth album, and the Ramones were not used to Phil's ways of recording an album. Phil was, I guess you could say, he was over the top in his methods of record recording. But all of these methods worked for Phil in the past, past, so why wouldn't they work now? Now, 2 years prior, Phil had seen the Ramones perform in '77, and he wanted to work with them then. They were getting ready to release their third album, Rocket to Russia, but they were cool with the way things were, so they passed on that invite from Phil to produce that album. However, for album number 5, they thought about it, I guess, and they said, yeah, let's hire Phil Spector to do this one. Phil apparently loved to wave his gun around, and he used to bring it out in front of many clients. John Lennon, Ronnie Spector, Debbie Harry of Blondie, and Phil's gun waving was used to threaten the Ramones. The late Dee Dee Ramone once described a night when they were rehearsing really, really late. He was exhausted. He told Phil he wanted to go home. Phil then pulled out his gun and said, I don't think so. We know, obviously, Phil had a fascination with guns, and he got away with what he did for a really long time. And why no one ever said anything? Maybe they were just afraid. They just didn't say anything. This just says to me that Phil Spector had a lot of power. And it's evident as we move on with the story of how much power he really did carry with him for a very long time. Phil ended up laying low for years after the Ramones album came out. However, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1989 as a non-performer. Tina Turner inducted him, and Ike Turner was there, and crazily enough, Ike thought he was going to be inducting Phil. And Ike said he was kind of uncomfortable with the fact that his ex, Tina, was there. But Tina inducted Phil because she's the queen. And weirdly enough, after that movie came out, What's Love Got to Do with It in 1993, now Phil got inducted in '89. Tina inducted Phil, yet he had no good words to say about the film and just defended Ike. Then, 2 years later, Phil Spector inducted Tina and Ike into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1991. And if you watch Phil inducting Ike and Tina Turner into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Phil just seemed like a quirky guy. I mean, he had all of his notes written on paper, and they were kind of all folded in different ways, and just the way he spoke was just strange. You gotta watch it. He was a genius when it came to making music, but when it came to living normal life, nothing was normal about it. In 1994, Phil wrote a lengthy letter to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame saying that the Ronettes, the group he helped create and was on his Phillies record label, he said the Ronettes should not be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame because they didn't contribute enough to the music industry. He married Ronnie Spector, the group's lead singer. He adopted 3 children with her. The Ronettes got a Grammy in 1965 for their hit Walking in the Rain, and one of the first amazing girl groups of all time, but they didn't contribute enough. And oh yeah, the Ronettes were asked by the Beatles to open for them for 14 dates back in the 60s. However, Phil did not allow Ronnie to go. I'm guessing because he was so extremely jealous, and another singer ended up taking her place on that tour. How crazy is that? The Ronettes, however, did get inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2007. Keith Richards inducted them. He loves the Ronettes so much. And Ronnie opened her speech by saying, I never thought I'd get here, but here I am. I'm glad they finally got there too. The Ronettes had such a powerful sense of style that Amy Winehouse designed her look after the Ronettes. After Ronnie did find out that Phil Spector had passed, she said that it was a sad day for the music industry and it was a sad day for her. She also called her love affair with Phil a fairy tale. But as much as he was a brilliant producer, he was a lousy husband. Quoted by Ronnie. So I've taken you through some of the not so normal points of Phil Spector's life, but now we are at the point where everything basically imploded for Phil Spector, and unfortunately someone lost their life due to his crossfire. Lana Clarkson, she was a beautiful model and actress, and she has a long list of movie and TV shows that she was a part of. She made appearances on shows like Who's the Boss, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, and Scarface, which I had no idea, but I totally remember the scene that she was a part of. Remember the woman that was sitting on the chair, the lounge chair at the Babylon Club, and Stephen Bauer, oh my gosh, was he not a cutie pie in that movie? He went over and tried to hit on her. He stuck his tongue out at her. She slapped him. That was Lana Clarkson. She came from a nice family. She had a brother, she had a sister, and she lost her dad in 1978. So her family picked up and moved to LA, and that was actually probably a great choice for her because she was absolutely gorgeous. So if you're going to get into the modeling and entertainment industry, LA was the place to be. Lana's biggest screen success was in the 80s and the 90s. She even did TV commercials for Kmart, Nike, and even Anheuser-Busch. It is said that once Lana hit her 30s, her career pretty much came to a halt. And that is just so not cool, but that is how it was. I feel like you have a better chance now of being successful later in life due to great platforms like YouTube. So she had to pick up odd jobs to support herself. And one of those jobs included her being a VIP hostess at the House of Blues in West Hollywood. The night of February 2nd, 2003 is the night she unfortunately met Phil Spector. Phil's chauffeur, Adriano D'Souza, gave a lot of information as to what happened on that particular night. Before Phil went to the House of Blues that night, Adriano said he had already taken Phil to a couple of other clubs with two different women. Now, what happened to those women? I couldn't find out anything about them. Did they go with Phil to the House of Blues? I just couldn't find out anything. Who they were, where they went, I don't know. When Lana was introduced to Phil at the club, she was told to treat him like gold. And the weird thing is, she thought Phil was a woman because remember, Phil wore these crazy wigs all the time, so he didn't even look like a man. Remember when Phil got into that car accident in the 70s where he almost died and he had a lot of stitches around his face and his head? Well, it is said that the reason why he started wearing all of those crazy wigs was to hide all of the lacerations on his skull. Lana ended up getting in the car and going back to Phil's mansion with him that night. Why she went, couldn't find any information on that. What he said to her, how he got her to go back home with him, I don't know. Because remember, when she first met Phil at the club, she thought he was a woman. After Lana had been at the mansion for a couple of hours, Adriano, the chauffeur, heard a gunshot. Then he saw Phil come out of the mansion, and Phil said to him, "I think I shot someone." When police did get to the mansion, they found Lana slumped in a chair with one gunshot through the roof of her mouth. And it sounds like the scene was pretty graphic. I won't get into all of those details. I know that there are pictures online showing Lana. I will be honest, I did not look at them. Robert Shapiro, remember him? He was the one who defended O.J. Simpson. Well, he ended up defending Phil Spector. And the whole defense case brought up that Phil didn't kill Lana, but she committed suicide. It is said that the day Lana met Phil, the unfortunate day she met Phil, she went out and bought a new pair of shoes. Not something one would do if they planned on not being around in the future. And a very sad part of the case includes the media bashing on Lana, saying that she was just a washed-up actress who needed to end her life. Here are people still defending Phil Spector. Why? On May 9th of 2009, Phil was indicted for the murder of Lana Clarkson, and he was sentenced to 19 years in prison. If he had lived until the time he was able to be eligible for parole, he would have been 88 years old. Throughout Phil's time here on Earth, he threatened many people with his gun, and 5 women testified against Phil during this trial, saying that he had threatened to kill them. And even Phil's son Gary blamed Lana for Phil doing what he did, saying that she most likely antagonized Phil to shoot her. Weeks before Phil killed Lana, he was quoted saying to the British Telegraph that he was insane to an extent and that devils fought inside of him. There is an interview on YouTube, there's actually 2, in which Phil talks about the night that Lana Clarkson died inside of his mansion. It's on a channel called Wall of Guilt. I'll link it down below. And if you're still interested in hearing about this case a little more and hearing what Phil had to say about it, go ahead and watch these videos. It really, I I mean, just to hear how he talks about that night, it's crazy. Phil was later treated for bipolar disorder, and it was said that he most likely had Parkinson's disease. And in 2014, Phil had completely lost his ability to speak. He divorced his third wife, Rochelle Short, in April of 2016, and she continued to live in Phil's mansion called the Pyrenees Castle until it was sold in May of 2021. He was a musical genius. There's absolutely no denying it. And he was a mogul by the time he was 21 years old. He was eclectic, he was smart, and he was a killer. This was definitely a lot of information for me and you to take in. And it really is amazing that he got away with all the stuff he got away with. Famous musicians had to know what type of person Phil Spector was and the tactics that he used to get recordings done, but they still chose to work with him. And then he ended up going in seclusion for so many years. If he had only just stayed there. If there are any stories about musicians you would like me to research and talk about, let me know in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for sticking around, and I thank you so much for your support. I truly appreciate it. Remember, guys, to just go ahead and be kind to everyone. Be free, and always remember to keep rocking.